In the 1961 issue of the Journal of Communication, Jack Gibb explained a concept called communication climates, referring to the communication behaviors in a group that could increase or decrease defensiveness. He classified climates as either supportive or defensive. One of his recommendations was to combat the defensive producing pattern of neutrality with the more supportive pattern of empathy. Neutrality implies that we really don't care about what a person says, believes, etc. Essentially, you are communicating that the other person does not exist or is not worth your time. This lecture focuses on how you can become more empathetic by focusing on how you respond to another person's messages. Gibb identified responses that contribute to neutrality, or disconfirming responses, as well as discussing the responses that acknowledge another person's existence, or confirming responses. Gibb felt that both confirming and disconfirming responses contribute to the communication climate. The bottom line is that you should avoid disconfirming responses and instead strive to use confirming responses. There are several types of responses that come under the category of disconfirming. The names may differ by textbook or professor, but the concepts are essentially the same. The first response is impervious. Also called disregarding, it is essentially ignoring someone. You provide no feedback to the speaker, giving the appearance that you haven't even noticed that someone is trying to communicate with you. You may do this blatantly, such as when you turn away from another person, or less obviously, such as avoiding eye contact or just not responding. This is not limited to face-to-face communication, but includes failing to return phone calls, responding to texts or emails, sending cards, etc. This is why some people get upset when their birthday is not recognized with at least a statement of birthday wishes. They feel others haven't acknowledged their existence. While it may not be intentional on your part, it could be perceived as not caring enough to remember. Oftentimes, even people we don't pay attention to may have something valuable to contribute, so it's not always about the effect on the other's self-esteem, but a lack of exposure to good ideas. Plus, you may look stupid when you don't listen effectively and you repeat something that someone else has already said. An interruption is often interpreted as a bid for superiority. When you cut someone off, you might be communicating that you think you are superior to the other person, so your message overrides theirs, implying that what you have to say is more important, and perhaps that the other person shouldn't even attempt communication. Some people interrupt to complete another person's sentences, which may communicate that they can't be bothered to hear people out, that they feel they have better ways to say it, or that they don't think the other person is intelligent enough to finish their thought without assistance. It may even communicate that the interrupter, or the receiver of the original message, feels that he or she knows what a person is thinking and feeling better than the sender. This type of response contributes to one of Gibb's other defensive patterns of superiority. And of course, your nonverbal communication may come into play as well. In a face-to-face situation, this may extend to consistently answering telephone calls, responding to text messages, or checking your social media sites in the presence of another person, communicating that he or she is not as important as all those other things that might be vying for your attention and interrupting your time with the other person. In a face-to-face situation, in a face-to-face conversation, this may extend to consistently answering telephone calls, responding to text messages, or checking your social media sites rather than paying attention to the person in front of you. He or she is not as important as all of those other things that are vying for your attention and interrupting you, therefore interrupting the other person. An irrelevant response is one where, although you do respond to the speaker, it is in a way that is unrelated to what he or she said. You essentially change the subject because what the other person is talking about isn't worth your attention. It implies, or makes obvious, that you missed their main ideas. If you are relating your experience driving home to me and I say, I wonder what's for dinner, while I may be acknowledging that you exist, I am telling you that what you say doesn't matter and that what I'm thinking is more important. Related is the tangential response, where you acknowledge that you've heard the other speaker, but immediately take the conversation off into another direction, going off on a tangent. For example, if you're explaining to me about how your day went at work and you end with, "Can you see why I'm upset?" and I respond with, "Yes, I'm thinking I might go to the movie tonight." I'm implying that I wasn't really listening and that my thoughts are more important than what you have to say. When you respond impersonally to someone, you give the impression that your comments are generic and not specific to the person. Yes, that makes sense. Oftentimes, the responses are heavily loaded with euphemisms or cliches, such as, well, that's the way the ball bounces. You appear not to care. It could extend as well to not including a person's name in an email message, making it look like you've copied and pasted a message from one place into another. Very similar is an ambiguous response, where you offer only a vague response that the other person can only guess at your meaning, can't figure out at all what your view is. Somebody might say, well, I find that interesting. And we can't really figure out whether interesting means fascinating or interesting as a euphemism for boring. When you are responding incoherently, you use incomplete sentences, ramble, backtrack, etc. What you are saying is difficult, if not impossible, for someone else to understand. This often happens when you're distracted and not paying complete attention to someone, like when I'm on the computer and talking to somebody else on the phone. I think I can type and hold a conversation at the same time, but then what I'm saying makes no sense to the other person on the phone. Again, implying that what I'm doing is more important. All of these responses have focused on verbal communication, or the use of words. This next one is specific to your nonverbal message. You are responding incongruously or inconsistently if your nonverbal behavior contradicts your verbal behavior. For example, your words may say, "It sounds like you've had a difficult day," but your voice may communicate a lack of concern or boredom, or perhaps even worse, sarcasm. Another example is if your friend asks you, "How does this dress make me look?" and you respond without even looking at the other person. Your words say one thing, but your nonverbal says something completely different. Now, we all respond disconfirmingly to others occasionally. It's when these behaviors become a habit that they become a problem. Now that you know what disconfirming messages are, try to avoid sending them. This may mean that you'll have to do some significant introspection because you might be doing some of these without even being aware of it. So don't ignore others. Instead, listen attentively to what others may have to say and make sure that it looks like you are listening. Not eyes on the screen, fingers on the keyboard, or the like. Asking questions to confirm that you've heard the other person really helps out a lot here, especially when you're in a situation such as driving, where you can't safely look at your passenger when responding. While interruptions are often warranted, make sure that you interrupt only when necessary. And strive for congruence or consistency between your verbal and nonverbal messages. Not that you should never engage in sarcasm, but consider if the time is appropriate or if it has become a habit for you. Now let me offer a caveat. There may be times when it is appropriate to send disconfirming messages. In fact, one study argued that impervious responses, those where you ignore others, may be considered competent communication if the message being sent by the other person is denigrating his or her self-concept. And of course, the timeout punishment may be more effective in addressing an issue than direct confrontation. But in both cases, the use of disconfirming responses is deliberate and meant to impact another's behavior. We can learn something from the Zulu culture. When the Zulu meet others, they say "Sawubona," and the response is "Sikona." Now, I may have messed up the pronunciation, and we all know that when you're translating from one language to another, crucial subtleties may be lost, but essentially it translates into "I see you" and "I am here." This communicates that until you saw me and acknowledged me, I didn't exist. In fact, a Zulu folk saying reinforces this: a person is a person because of other people. So by communicating with you, I confirm that you do indeed exist. Gibb recommends that to become more empathetic, we replace those disconfirming messages with confirming messages. The easiest and perhaps the most direct method is to directly acknowledge another person's communication. React to it verbally and non-verbally. If someone asks you a question, respond, or at least acknowledge that you heard it. If you receive an email or a text, respond, even if it is just to say that you can't address it at the moment. Okay, there are occasions when you can't respond to an email or a text, if you are at the theater or in a lecture, for example, but make sure you respond in a timely manner. You can also show that you agree with the content of what someone else is saying, assuming you actually do agree. You can reinforce what another has said by agreeing with it. A supportive response tries to reassure the other person that the content or what they are feeling is appropriate or understandable. You could also support the other person by trying to make him or her feel better, saying something like, "It sounds like you have a really good handle on the situation, and it'll all work out for the best." A clarifying response demonstrates that you really want to understand another's message or feelings. Ask questions to gather more information. Encourage the other to expand or paraphrase what you think you heard to make sure that you understood. This often helps if you don't necessarily agree with the content but want to show that you care about the other person. The last suggestion Gibb offers is expression of positive feeling, which involves saying something that indicates that you have a positive feeling about what someone has said, such as, "That sounds like a great idea," or "I knew you would figure something out." While we've discussed the importance of your nonverbal cues matching your verbal messages, it definitely bears repeating. Any of these confirming messages could easily be negated if your tone of voice implies that you don't care, if it sounds like you're just parroting responses, or if you avoid making eye contact, etc. The bottom line is that you should show interest in others and their problems, expressing concern where appropriate, and being sincere. Now, this does not mean that you have to get involved, but you should show that you care. Processing time. Given an example, could you correctly classify a response to a message as confirming or disconfirming? Which of the disconfirming responses do you think are the most damaging to another's self-esteem? Might you perhaps intentionally or unintentionally send disconfirming messages to people you care about? Or to put it another way, could someone perceive that you are using disconfirming communication? And which confirming responses do you think you can substitute for your disconfirming responses? Knowing more about confirming and disconfirming messages, you should be able to, as Jack Gibbs suggested, combat neutrality with empathy on your way to becoming a more empathetic communicator.